We're going to talk about these 6 aspects of putting a project together, starting with mission, going on to identify needs after we ask the question and get the question answered about what the mission of the organization is. There are times when we get involved in a project where we have to put the brakes on and say, you know what, it's not time to build the building. You need to talk more about what you're trying to accomplish before we start to suggest facility solutions and so forth. We want to talk about how to create people flow in these projects. How is that going to happen? What's the benefit of that? What do we do with it once it begins to happen? We're going to talk about hospitality. We'll get involved in talking about creating a building that has a sense of relevancy about it, which means that the building has to be changeable, because what's relevant today is not going to be relevant 5 years from now. 5 years from now, people are going to walk into this building and they're going to see something that says, boy, that's so 2018. I wish we could create timeless architecture in my genre, but the truth is that there has to be a sense of relevancy brought into all of these projects. So there has to be elements that are introduced in order to allow us to adapt and adopt whatever's relevant in culture at that particular point in time. You know, it reminds me of when Paul, I taught junior high in my church for 14 years, and I relied on the book of Acts because it was an action-packed book. And I would be reminded of when Paul would go into a new location, what was his first thing to do? He would go in and he would look around and he would figure out, who are these people? What's important to them? How do I relate to them? What's their culture built around? And so that's the same thing that we need to do with our buildings, because our buildings are the first statement that we're going to make to a community. What is it that's important to them? I've had experiences in my life on mission trips. I went on a missions trip to Cuba a number of years ago. And one night on a Saturday evening, we drifted up into the hills, aside from the little town that we were in, to worship in large group. And we went into the hills because in that community, and all communities in Cuba, you're not allowed to gather in masses of greater than a certain number. And we had to go into the hills to a barn to have a worship service so that we wouldn't attract the attention of the people that were in charge from a political standpoint in that community. We literally shooed the pigs out of a pig barn. We laid palm fronds down to cover the excrement on the ground. We rolled palm logs in and had one of the most worshipful experiences of my life. Worshiping on pig excrement doesn't work in America. We have a different set of expectations because we're a different cultural organization in the communities in which we live. So different things for different people at different times, but we have to be aware of what do we do to create that sense of relevancy in the communities. And that implies that our buildings have to be flexible. So many times I go into a project and they're showing me around the building in these buildings, which were largely built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s as load-bearing masonry wall buildings. That's the way our churches were built. Built to be permanent, right? Built to be established, iconic form. Load-bearing masonry walls, never going anywhere. Let the wind howl, they're not going to fall down. But terribly inflexible, because you try to change space to make it into something new, to minister to a community in a different way. And they're so happy about the fact that they have no debt on these buildings, but they're so blessed / saddled with these buildings that they don't know what to do with them. How do we adopt and adapt these buildings to change these buildings into something that meets the expectations of a current culture? So we talk about flexibility. So let's dive into this. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get this to work, but doesn't look like. I'll just do this by hand. We start with mission. We ask the question, what is it about is in your community that you're doing in order to reach this community? So we want to make sure that we don't skip a step in the very beginning. When we start a project, when we're told that we're going to be working with an organization, the very first thing that we start talking about is tell us who you are and how you meet the community. How do you do this? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And I get the big picture. The big picture is that we're trying to introduce people to a relationship in Christ. But I want to know more specifically how that happens uniquely in your communities. So any of the designers that work with our organization start with this kind of a conversation. Mission leads to activity. We can't have a serious conversation about activity until we start that, which then results in a discussion about facility. So we need to get it in the right order. We don't start with a facility discussion. We start with an understanding that the facility is not a monument to some architect. It's not a monument to a building committee. It's not a monument to a pastor. These buildings are tools to serve in the kingdom to move people towards a relationship in Christ. How does that happen? What is the story that your building conveys to people as they see the building from the outside, as they approach the building, as they come into the building? What are you trying to communicate? The building will communicate something. If it's opulently designed with materials that are exaggerated, costly materials, you're going to convey something to people as they come into the building. If it's designed so that the spaces are uncomfortable for people to be in because they're so dehumanizing. One of the big things that's prevalent in design today is what's called warm industrial. Warm industrial has a really good connotation to somebody 28 years old. But if you're my age and older, warm industrial just feels like industrial. It doesn't matter what color you slap on the wall. It doesn't feel good. So you have to be understanding what the intergenerational aspects of a project are going to be. Generations think differently about space. The truth of the matter is we're not designing today's buildings for the generation that's about ready to pass on in life, right? If we don't start thinking for the next generation, then we're going to miss an opportunity to bring that generation into a conformity with a life in Christ. So we need to think outside our own self. But understanding what kind of a story the church building facility has to say is an important part of it. Every ministry has a unique story. People will all the time say, I've been to such and such a church and we want to do something exactly like this. And sometimes they are missing the fact that what they did in that particular community may or may not apply to this particular community. It happens all the time. I mean, particularly nowadays when families get fractured, they get sent all over the United States for jobs and so forth. And mom and dad have gone to visit somebody down in Florida, and they come back and they say, we took some photographs of this great church, and we're trying to present these photographs to people in northern Minnesota, and they're going, this isn't us. This isn't the way that we relate to the space. This is not the kinds of things that work for us. It's not the space that they feel comfortable in. So we have to be careful not to imitate those kinds of things, but to take what we can and transfer that to the local vernacular, or to the way that people function in that new location. We ask the question, what are your ministry strengths? That's an important question to ask, almost as important as what are your ministry weaknesses? What are the things that you're not able to do that you wish you could because you don't have the facilities to make it work? Sometimes it's a matter of helping them understand things that they don't even see. Sometimes we're working with organizations and they are so close to the issues that they don't see the broader picture. So from our perspective, it's helping them understand things that they're not even aware of. In our first night of a charrette exercise, and again, I'll describe what that means, oftentimes it's an intergenerational discussion. We're trying to help older people understand the perspective of younger people, drawing it out of the younger people to help explain, and vice versa. Having the younger people, I mean, it's true in most churches, the funding for a project isn't coming from the 20-somethings, right? It's coming from people who are established, who've been around for a while, who have the means to be able to make something happen. And sometimes they come in and they'll stake their claim on something. I was in a discussion with a church down in Monroe, Louisiana, one night. There was a group of about 40 people around this big U-shaped table. And one of the individuals in that meeting said, if I'm going to give my money to this project, we are going to have the biggest cross on the front of this building that you can imagine. That's my vision, is a cross to the community. We're going to stake our claim. And another younger fella across the room saying, well, if you're going to do that, I'm not going to this church anymore. Because the cross has become a barrier to some people. So we had this debate for 45 minutes about religious symbology. what's the right way to do this? And the older people in the room largely agreed with the fellow that made the original statement, saying, it's important for us to be clear to the community about who we are. We are believers in Christ. The cross is a strong, powerful symbol to who we are. And the younger people saying, yes, but there are people who are unchurched, and back and forth and back and forth. It finally evolved into a discussion between this guy that originally made the statement and this younger guy that had spoken up right after him, and back and forth they went for a few minutes. It turned out it was father-in-law, son-in-law, by the way. And they were having this discussion that had been a continuation of a discussion that they'd had in their own living room over holiday meals and so forth. We eventually, in this project, depicted a cross, but it was a very modern element. It was a very sculptural cross that both organizations, the young and the older people in the church, could live with. The younger people said, that's a relevant symbol. That's cool. We like that. It was very sculptural. And the older people saying, that's a cross. We can see it. Same thing that we did up we had a similar discussion up in Ames, Iowa with an organization. And at the end of the project, they were debating still, do we put a cross on the building or not put a cross? The workmen found out that this debate was going on and went out and found shards of steel that were left over on the project. And one afternoon, with a welder, welded a 40-foot high cross made of shards of steel. It was beautiful. And all they were doing was scabbing pieces of steel together. And the church rallied around this and ended up, and if you drive on the intersection of Interstate 35 headed up to Minneapolis and Iowa Highway 30, you'll look up and see at the end of the project that they scabbed together these shards of steel, and it still erects to this day. People were able to rally around this as a powerful symbol. So these kinds of discussions are going to evolve. Where do we stake our claim? What are the sacred cows? But understanding, what are the strengths? What are the things we're accomplishing? What are the things we're not accomplishing? Number two, identifying what the needs are. We want to be clear what is going on in your community. And so many times, they'll say, you've done a lot of projects before. Tell us what the needs are in the community. And again, I don't have a lot of answers. I mean, there are a lot of communities that I work in over and over and over again. I'm very familiar with the Dallas area. I am actually born in Texas. I was born in Lubbock and lived in Wichita Falls, and my brother lives here, and I've been down to Texas dozens and dozens of times. But the reality of it is that I live in Utah. I need to tap into what you know about your communities. What are the needs in your community? And if you don't know, here are 10 ways you can go out and find out what the needs are. If you don't know. Sometimes our churches are so disconnected from the community that they have no fathomable idea about what's going on in their communities. All they know is what happens inside the boundaries of our walls, whoever shows up and comes in through the front door. There are ways to find this out. There are ways to find out what the needs are. And so we will help you do that to mine that information out. But thinking about the building as a ministry tool, that is very, very important. And thinking beyond Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights. How many different ways can you use a project throughout the course of the week? You've sensed from the discussions this morning that this building is used as a pre-K learning center. They derive a fairly major portion of their income, and it'll be ever increasing. Right now, they're not at full capacity. This is designed to hold 200 plus children. Right now, 3 months into it, they have 91 children here. They received their first check, was it, Brett? They received a $15,000 check just yesterday or the day before for the first turnaround. Yeah, Pastor, you mentioned that at dinner last night. So we'll see how that goes in the future, but the idea is to use the building throughout the week to receive income, which will supplement some of the decisions that were made financially in this project. But more than ever, how do we plug into the lives of those people who are bringing their kids in the front door? Some of those people are the unchurched of our communities. It's that back to that creating people flow. How do we do that in an intentional way? Childcare is a tremendously good way to do that. But I got to tell you, prior to getting involved, and you're going to hear from Eric in just a few minutes, prior to getting involved in the childcare approach towards things, I had met so many churches that had childcare facilities in their facilities that were major sources of contention amongst the members of the church. They were not operating efficiently. They were not operating well. The main problem being that the church maybe had 3 or 4 rooms that attended to the needs of small children, and they said, well, rather than letting these rooms sit fallow, we'll start a preschool, and they will put 30 or 40, maybe 50 kids in a preschool, and it's almost impossible to get on top of it financially when you have that few kids going on in your preschool program. My kids attended, my kids are older now, they're 29, 31, and 34. But when my kids were little, we sent them 2 blocks away to a preschool that was very well known in our area, that was run by a church. There were 45 kids in that preschool. Not once in 9 years did anybody ever make an attempt to connect to my wife and I personally. Not one time. Talk about missed opportunities. I did a 28,000 square foot building for them. They had no idea that my kids had gone to preschool there. And I knew from doing that project that preschool was a major source of contention because they were losing money on it every year. And they said, oh, well, it's our ministry. They weren't ministering to my kids. My kids were not learning about Jesus Christ. They were just being really kind to my kids and being very generous to us for a low tuition rate. But they had entirely missed, like most churches do, the creation of people flow and the income generation that can come from a well-run preschool. We work with Heather, is in the back over here. Heather, wave your hand up in the air. She's with Learning Care Group. Learning Care Group has got this figured out. This is a group like Nelson that's got it. They understand how to run a preschool. Don't try and do something you don't understand. Turn it around to something that becomes a positive from a cash flow standpoint, and your job then is to figure out how to train those kids in Christ and how to tap into the lives of the parents that will come in. They just started a program. Pastor ducked his head back out, but he was telling me last night they just started a parent training program on weeknights after the kids are picked up. That's a way to begin to tap into the relationship side of these families. That begins to make sense from a ministry standpoint. So, childcare is an excellent way for that to happen if it's done right. If it's not done right, avoid it at all costs because it will divide your church. Becoming a ministry that's impacting the next generation. This is an age group, too, where these kids are vulnerable. This is an age group when we can talk to them about who Christ is and embed that in their minds at a very early age. These are just examples that I'm going to flip through of different child care facilities. Let's see if we can get that to roll. Community centers. Matt, when he was up here, flashed some pictures up of Hub 801, home of Genesis Project Church. In May of 2014, BGW opened a 25,000 square foot for-profit event center in Ogden, Utah. We had Hill Air Force Base events there. We had Cannondale Bicycles come in for 3 days. We've had quinceaneras. We've had weddings. We've had a number of events. And over the course of the next 7 or 8 months, establish a for-profit business in the heart of our community in Ogden. It was a converted Coca-Cola bottling plant that we took 25,000 square feet and changed over. In January of 2015, the Genesis Project was introduced into this building. They had been itinerant for a number of years, floating from warehouse space to warehouse space. They were a church of 900. In 6 months, I was at an event with Matt on June 23rd, 2015. I'll never forget that date, and asked him, how is your congregation doing? And in 6 months, he had grown from 900 to 1,300 because he finally had space that worked for them. He finally had a sound system and a lighting system that worked for them. And we started a process at that point of going from a non-lease payment to a lease situation to an ownership position and turn the business over to the church to operate. So the church now today runs a event center, a for-profit event center, about 1/3 to 1/2 of which covers their mortgage payment on the purchase of the building. So this was done for financial reasons, but more importantly, there are about 2,000 people a week that flow through this building that are exposed to the Genesis Project Church. Believers Church over in Chesapeake, Hub 757, also runs a daycare preschool development program. So they have both. They have both an event center. Their worship space is used as event center space. Their lobby or third space is also used as conjoining space for those kinds of events. But they also operate out of a separate entry point, childcare. They've got 2 sources of income going on. Again, you're going to hear more about this from Eric a little bit later on, but these are ways that a church can become embedded into their community. But you have to be intentional. It doesn't just work to have 2,000 people flow in your building. If you don't tell them who you are, we've missed an opportunity. So this is a way to create that people flow and then to impact their lives. At Matt's church, the folks that Matt reaches into the lives of are people coming out of prison halfway houses, prostitution, drug rehab programs, so on and so forth. These are people that are being trained in the event center about how to reignite into real life. These are training programs, job training programs, where people learn how to become re-socialized to society again. So these are the sorts of things that we can do. We can not just serve the needs of the community through the leasing of an event center space, but we can also change lives within the church itself. That's a picture of the main space, which seats about 750 people. Athletics and fitness, this is Annapolis Area Christian School. We finished this project, 88,000 square feet. Almost from the get-go, they were able to lease this building out for a total of combined 4 months a year to local athletic programs. The other 8 months were used by the school. But the lease programs in the 3 gymnasiums and the field house largely pay the mortgage on this 88,000 square foot project. They're embedded in the community because they've become relevant with both the facility and the surrounding fields into the athletic lives of these folks. And they become exposed to who they are as a Christian organization. So athletics, we're doing one right now in Harrison, Ohio. The YMCA, by the way, had largely become detached from the Christian church over the past 40 years. They used to be closely affiliated with the Christian church, and they largely became divorced from their Christian roots. That's changing. They're now figuring out how to embed back into churches. So we're planning a YMCA facility paired with LifeSpring Church in Harrison, Ohio. They're making intentional efforts to reconnect their Christian roots, who they are. So this is going to be a facility that has a lobby, like you see out here, a third space, that will serve during the week as the lobby space for the YMCA. So they'll have both athletics and other church-related type things going on in that space. So, very important to consider all the different options, whether they be fitness. We've done a variety of facilities that are just simple fitness facilities. Olathe Church Living Hope Church in Olathe, Kansas, where they created a space, actually in their lobbies, we have a storage space off to the side where they bring these interlocking mats out, and during the week, 3 mornings a week, they open it up to the moms in the neighborhood to come in and run exercise classes in that space. That building is about 1/3 the size of this project right here, but it's the major connecting point because they bring their kids in and let the kids go into the play area, supervised, while the moms go out and do exercise, and their coffee bar then becomes a juice bar. But it's a way to integrate into the lives of some of the local moms that live in the neighborhood surrounding the church. An area that is very interesting is that churches are almost automatically entrusted with children and older people. So senior care is one of those areas that you can have a meaningful impact into your community. It has to be the right location. And by the way, in all of these options, there is a business analysis that is done for your area to make sure you're not just moving this forward on a hunch. There is a business analysis, and Eric, you'll get into that a little bit later and talk about that. We're doing a senior care facility at Journey Church in Apopka, Florida. Obviously, Florida is a tremendously fertile ground for older people. I guess it's taxes. They don't have taxes there. Is that the deal? I think that's what attracts them. I've never actually asked that question, but I think they've got a very low tax rate for seniors coming down from places that are heavily taxed areas. So we're planning a 65,000 square foot senior facility that will graduate people to the next level of care. So they've got a 4-stage process to move people from simple assisted living to a more intensive care facility as they progress through their aging years. But again, it can be terribly, terribly good in terms of meeting people, not the seniors, the family of the seniors. My mom's in a senior care unit in Denver, Colorado right now. The ministry that happens is not to my mom. My mom has no idea who's coming in the door and who's left. She has no idea who she's met, who she hasn't met. It's to us, because we've entrusted my mother to a facility, and we have gotten to know that staff intimately. That's where the ministry lies, is with the families of the people. Well, senior care is one of those things that also can be financially very, very helpful to a church organization, if it's the right location. Education centers, performing arts centers. We've seen a number of performing arts centers. We're doing one in Escondido, California right now. New Vintage Church has just purchased an existing dilapidated 600-seat theater. We're going to renovate the theater, and we're building 19,000 square feet, two-story childcare space next to it in downtown Escondido. This is a facility that will serve 9 different arts organizations in their community. They are going to integrate and create a connection point to arts organizations and then connect to society that way. On Friday night, this is going to be one happening place, not for church, but for whatever art type of thing is going on, whether it be gallery stroll or whether it be a performance drama type thing or a music event. So again, a lot of commonalities between worship places, places for worship, and good quality space for the performing arts. A lot of duplicate uses between good quality childcare space and the needs of the church. Good similarities between event center space and what's needed for church space. That's the common thread that we see in a lot of these different facilities. Entrepreneurial centers. This is a facility called the Salt Mine Project. Let's see if I can get it to come up. Whoops. I'll go back to that. Salt Mine Project in Salt Lake City, Utah. There we go. It'll pop up in a second. The salt mine was introduced into our community by a group of churches from the Atlanta area. They came in and created 19,000 square feet of space. Maybe it'll come up this time. There we go. 19,000 square feet of space that is for lease space for your business as you're starting your business out. They come in. These kinds of workspace type things are the up and coming trend. They're all over the nation now. This is also home to a church planting organization. They have a room that seats 180 people that's used during the week for conferencing events and those kinds of things, training events. It's also used on Sundays, the least used time for a business center. It's used as the birthplace for a new church outreach that's going on in Salt Lake City, Utah, in a suburb in Sandy, Utah. So these are the kinds of things that you can do. And not only that, but the people in the church now are leasing space inside the entrepreneurial center, and they're beginning to get to know, they're infusing themselves into the path of the people who are unbelieving people coming in there for simply business purposes. So this is the kind of overlap that you can begin to experience to take advantage of these kinds of people flows. Cafes in third place. How many of you all have heard the term third place? Okay, several of you, maybe half of you have heard the term third place. So baby boomers largely operated out of 2 places. Their relationships were born in work and neighborhood, work and home. As subsequent generations came along, Matt's generation, I didn't know you were a Gen X till last night, Matt, but Matt's a Gen X guy. Matt's generation and subsequent generations began to demand more of community-styled spaces, particularly this millennial generation. The millennial generation born between 1980 and in the year 2000, roughly in those terms, depending on who's telling the story here. That generation largely is very much wanting to be connected to community space. Well, churches have figured out that we can create a space that people are incorporated into the body in that space, not in here. They may come and have a very worshipful personal experience in here or hear God's word in here, but in terms of the relationships that are fostered that lead to a discipling type of situation, it happens out there. That's third place. So creating quality third place has caused these buildings to have to create narthex space on steroids. When I first got involved in architecture, a narthex was a place where you came in, you had some coat racks, you shook the rain off your coat and hung up your coat, grabbed the bulletin and went into worship. And after worship, you came back out, boom, gone to the parking lot because it was too crowded. I mean, the narthex spaces were a 20th the size of the worship space. Those kinds of buildings are struggling now because they don't have space where people can create the kinds of relationship. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, it didn't matter because people were integrated all week long in their communities. They didn't stray 35 miles to go to work. They worked in their communities. They knew each other throughout the week. But we live fractured lives. So people have to be more intentional about infusing themselves into the network of relationships that occurs in the church. If somebody finally gets the courage to come to your church and open the door and cross that threshold, which is a major event for some people, you've got to be able to connect to them. You've got to figure out how do we, other than handing them a bulletin, you've got to figure out a way for that to happen. And third place is where that happens. I remember back in, when I first got involved, at BGW, I'd done probably 20 churches. Nothing that approached cafe-type space the way that we do them now. I mean, you saw it out there. It's a real cafe for all intents and purposes. It's a real cup of coffee. It actually tasted like coffee this morning. It was the real deal. People have a different set of expectations for those kinds of things. I thought that the upscale Starbucks-like experience was going to be a fad. It's not a fad. It's only getting stronger. It's an expectation now that you're going to be hospitable and accommodating to people when they come in, and you're going to serve them a real cup of coffee, not something that tastes like a brown crayon dipped in hot water. That's the way we used to do it. Mrs. Folgers, remember? You just put some Mrs. Folgers in there, and that was good enough. Mrs. Folgers don't cut it anymore. You have to have something that's a little bit more of a experience, for better word. So cafe spaces are critically important, and it is the space where people are made to feel like they're welcome. If you design a really wonderful third place and you have a great cafe and the church is not ready to receive them, don't bother. It's not the cafe in the third place that convinces people. It's the relationships born out of that space. That space facilitates people who have already made a mindset change. I attend a evangelical free church in Salt Lake City, Utah that's been in existence as a missions church since 1871 to Brigham Young. We're a little more modern now than we were in 1871, but in that church, the reason I stuck to that church is because when I was a college student 40 years ago, Eunice Bellamy and Dorothy Ernst, some of the people that at the time I thought were so ancient, they were over 60, so ancient, were inviting my roommates and I over to their homes for pork chops on Sunday afternoons. It was the creation of that relationship around food that caused us to stick. We were eating hot dogs and ragu all week long, and spaghetti, because we knew how to cook spaghetti. We could deal with warming up some ragu or cooking some hot dogs and slathering them with mustard. But in terms of real food, we were not getting real food. And Dorothy Ernst and Eunice Bellamy figured out missions to college students through this. Tremendously powerful. A cafe, tremendously powerful if it's used with intentionality behind reaching into the lives of people that will walk through that front door. Thinking outside the box a little bit. This is Shield of Faith down in Southern California in Pomona. This is an organization that has already tapped into public monies twice to create living situations for the African American population in their community. And now they're doing a facility that is a place to go live. They're tearing 2 bars down. They're in the process of purchasing the land that the bars sit on. They're going to create places to live, places to create a worship center / event center, and places for doing retail inside to create a marketplace environment in their location. Let me see, I have to skip forward on that. So things like the things that we see in our everyday communities. So again, merging and blurring the line between church and the community, and then figuring out when those people start to flow past you, how do we connect into them? How does that work? Creating people flow. That's what, for us, it's all about, is creating people flow. This is a diagram that we oftentimes use to explain. Churches in the past were created very sequentially. You had a place to worship. It maybe had some expansion capabilities. There was a little narthex on the front of that building where people could come in and receive a bulletin and shake the rain off and so forth and go into worship, and then they would go home. As time went on, we started to specialize, and we started to create space that was unique to children. People got tired of little children crying in the worship service. 100 years ago, it didn't matter. 50 years ago, it was starting to become bothersome. So they would create nursery spaces. They would start to create space for little children, for education opportunities and so forth. Then they would create an adult classroom wing or an administration wing, or we need a place for fellowship. Underneath the church didn't work for fellowship. So when you came into a sequential church, and I was born in Christ in a church that was exactly like this, I was brought into a church that I needed to be given a guide map or physically a guide. They would have people posted that knew the building well enough to be able to say, hey, Joe here is going to take you and show you where to take your kids because you're never going to find your way unless you go with Joe. And we would go wandering through the tunnels and so forth and finally come up where we needed to come up in our building. So in those days, it didn't matter because people weren't making decisions about where to go to church based on the architectural layout of a building. They weren't making decisions about where to go to church based on what the security provisions were for their kids. Security was a non-existent thought in our minds. When we got to church, with my kids were, 25 years ago when my kids were little and we got to church, car doors flew open, boom, gone. They knew where their friends were. They were off. We were not checking them in and asking questions about my daughter's diabetic needs. We weren't doing that. Kids were just gone. And if I wasn't teaching their class or my wife wasn't teaching their class, we picked them up 3 hours later, or they picked us up. They would come wandering back to where we were because they knew where to find us. So times have changed. It's a different situation now. This model is more of a community center model, a good community center. My partner, before I got involved in doing churches, came out of HOK Sports, Craig Elliott. Craig Elliott did a lot of community centers around the nation. And the concept behind a good community center, a modern community center, not the YMCAs of the 1950s, but a modern community center is clearly identifiable front door. Don't confuse people about front door. Glass, let people see in your building. The churches of the past, load-bearing masonry wall buildings, punched openings, shutters, curtains, blinds. You didn't look into the church. Us and them. Churches today, open. You see life. That's what a good community center has. And when you walk into a modern community center, ones that Craig was designing, it wasn't the ticket taker in the hallway down to the little sign that said men's locker room, and you went through the men's locker room and through the shower room and eventually found the pool and the gymnasium. You walk into a wide open space, and there's the pool, not the door to the pool, but 10 feet of glass across 50 feet, and you can see the kids splashing and playing in the splash pool and having fun. There's the wall of glass to the gymnasium, and the guys look like they're driving the lane right into the lobby space. The running track slices through, the climbing wall is in there, concession stands in there. Everything is attractional. Everything is identifiable, observable, evident. Boom, that's where I go to worship. That's where I go get a cup of coffee. That's where I go find a bathroom. You walked into it today. You go in that space, my kids go here. That's a secure check-in point for my kids. There's worship. Everything is clearly signed. That's a good community center. And churches have largely figured out that we need to become more friendly to the outside world by creating that identifiable front door, clear entry point to coming into our buildings. That's a different model. This is a project that we did over in Chesapeake, the Believers Church, that was patterned after this building, where we have that clear space where we go into and everything's available off there. There's where my kids go to play, there's administration, there's worship, there's bathrooms, there's cafe, there's kids' check-in point. Everything is available to us there, even small group spaces where people can come and hang out during the week and have their small group meetings in a space like that. Ultimately, flexible spaces too, spaces that we can add on to very easily. If the kids' programs take off, we can add on to it without disrupting the flow of the church. It's not right in the middle of everything. So creating that compelling, welcoming space that focuses clearly on hospitality gives us an opportunity to be hospitable. I know some people have that gift, and those people ought to be put in the forefront. Other people, they have no comprehension about how to be hospitable. Go hide them in the back 40. But place the people that have that gift in the forefront and allow them to flourish. Designing to the senses. Was it last night we were having dinner, you guys, and somebody said one of the major criteria of church decision-making was the smell of the church when people walk in? Was that Barna that you were quoting? What was it? Kids ministry. Oh, kids ministry. Walking into the kids ministry, if you're met with a really bad odor, not a good thing. Parents are out of there. Really important. I personally think that a lot of our older churches smell like old men. They have terrible ventilation systems, stale. It's like they've been in there smoking cigars or something. What have you been doing in this church? These are smells from the 1940s. Nothing's changed here. You know? We don't need to have our buildings be that unattractional. We can solve these problems with good ventilation. Think about all the senses. What are we seeing? Is this space that people want to be in? You know, 20 years ago, if you would have said, our churches of the future are going to have bare concrete floors and open steel structure, what would we have thought? I don't think so. But now it's almost an expectation, but it's got to be done right. And it's got to be in context of things like color. There has to be color in buildings. Color is important. The kinds of materials that we bring from the outside to the inside, that stone that's on the outside. That stone, by the way, is unique to Texas. It doesn't work in Utah. People would be thinking, what is this white stuff that's all over the walls here? It's got to have a relationship to the local vernacular. But thinking about those five senses is very, very important. Thinking about natural light. People love natural light. I've never met somebody that said, I prefer a absolutely black, pitch black room to a room that has good lighting. I mean, there are times when you're trying to sleep, I get that, but for the most part, people enjoy natural light, particularly when they come out of a worship experience like this, that there's a limited amount of natural light, which is because of technology that's used. And they want to go to a space where there is good natural light. It doesn't make them look ghastly in fluorescent lighting or bad lighting, too bright white of lighting. It plays a major role into the atmosphere of the space. So bringing those kinds of things in, bringing softer forms in that don't cost that much money in terms of the ceiling features or whether the floor patterns are echoing some of the things that are going on, breaking up the mass of the space with floor patterns can be very, very important to a space. I think more than anything is this notion of, I'm not sure what organic community really means. When the guys that were helping me put this presentation together, they were very clear what it meant to them. But I think what organic community means is that things are going to come together relationally in a very natural way, that it's not going to be forced, that this is going to be good space where people can come into and these relationships can be created in that kind of a situation. Blurring the line between outdoor and indoor spaces, taking advantage in the climates that allow us to do that, Dallas being one of them. I know that things get hot here in the summertime, but there's some crossover seasons where it can be delightful here if it's not raining and tornadoes and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, 2 weeks? You get 2 weeks? Oh, okay, so 2 weeks. Yeah, that's what they say in Florida. I made the mistake of going to Florida 13 years ago and saying, boy, you guys just live in paradise down here. We're just going to open this up. And they're like looking at each other like, he doesn't know. He has no fathomable idea what humidity really means here. And that's true, of course, here as well. You've got to be careful about those kind of things. But blurring that line in the times that it does make sense to allow people to go out and use those spaces. Okay, we got into this whole subject of relevancy, creating a sense of relevancy. Your community, whoops, let me get back. Looks like I've chased a little bit too far there. It's not going to do that. Your community is, well, it's just not going to do it. We're just going to have to go on. There you go. Your community is your mission field, right? That's who we're reaching out to. That's where we want to. That's what we want to reach. Does your building reflect the fact that we are welcoming to the community? Does it do that? Or is it an outpost building? This is about finding common ground. This is about forming bridges to people and using the building as a tool for that to happen. We want to make sure that we have done that. Creating a sense of relevancy. We talked about the idea of clear identifiable entry. This is the Hub 757 project that has both the daycare and the aspect over in Chesapeake. This project is one in 7,000 feet above sea level in Park City, Utah. What works in Park City, Utah in ski lodge country doesn't work in other parts of the world. But at this church, they were having a really hard time getting men to come to church. They'd rather be up on the ski slope. So the pastor had this vision for creating a lodge for their center, for where people come into. They have a gigantic roaring fireplace in their first phase, real wood fireplace. People come in and they put these 4-foot logs in there. The only thing missing in that space is the moose head. They have no moose heads in that space. But it feels comfortable to men who were somewhat estranged and alienated from church, largely because the decorating committees were largely governed by people who were female and over 65 years old. They looked like funeral parlors. Well, they changed that. And lo and behold, men started coming because it felt cool to them. There was technology incorporated into that space. Mountain life. Authentic feel, warm industrial design. You know what I've experienced? Once they see it and feel it, older people actually like it. They won't say that in the upfront meetings, but when you come into a space like that, it actually feels pretty good. A lot of different generations. And everybody likes the sense of community. Everybody is looking for community. It doesn't matter what generation you are. Everybody wants that community. So once you create spaces that foster organic community or do that, that's terrific. This is a space in a church that we did in central Iowa. And this space is used twice a year for art shows. They invite artists to participate in a galleried event. There's a contest and so on and so forth to these events. And they'll invite about 5,000 people a year to flow through their building. So their main gathering space, which is largely colored concrete floors and open steel structure, becomes a gallery space for twice a year. They also do theatrical events in there. This space, by the way, has that lime green and pumpkin orange color. 2009, it is so dated now. So in 2016, they went in and put a different color palette on those two walls to bring a sense of relevancy to their space. That's free. Color's free. I mean, I don't know what you pay for paint, 20 bucks a gallon or 25 bucks a gallon, but with 5 gallons of paint, they changed the relevancy aspect of their space. Color will do that. Color is one of the tools that the retail industry uses to alter what's in fashion and out of fashion, right? Every year that happens. So staying on top of that, important. I'll just kind of flip through some of these slides. Color is so important. And finally, flexibility is crucially important. Creating spaces that are flexible. We don't design with load-bearing masonry walls, ever. The only exception to that is tilt-up concrete walls for worship spaces, but we seldom do any kind of a building that has walls that are not meant to be changed. Really important to be thinking about those kinds of things. Master planning, it's very important for us to think about how master planning can be done in such a way to allow flexibility for the future. What's critically important today may not be critically important 5 years from now. So a master plan has flexibility built into it so things can change as time goes on. Adaptable spaces. How many different ways can we think to use a space? If you're going to use a space like the one that's outside this room for 45 minutes a week, what a missed opportunity. How many different ways can we do this? So creating spaces that have good storage next to them so we can change the function of that space from one event to the next. Storage is crucially important. Being open to all the options is crucially important too. It's not always the answer to do a new building. Sometimes the answer is to rebuild or to repurpose a building. But it has to be done with careful consideration because sometimes you can get in over your head in these projects. Sometimes the code officials will have their way with you on a repurposed building. So go in with your eyes open. Depend on people like either myself or S&B Construction to help guide you through that process. I'm doing that for a school up in Madison, Wisconsin right now. They found a 14,000 square foot house that they're converting to a school. And we're stepping through all the things that they hadn't thought about. You have to put an elevator in. You have to fire sprinkler the building. You have to do things in this building to change the structure in a major way. So these are very important things. But repurposing buildings can be a tremendously good tool to getting into a project. Refreshing a project, and ultimately at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we are thinking positively in terms of the way that we work with the local builders and so forth. I just figured out that that's a client, that Roddy Connor, that I've got a meeting with this afternoon. This is a missions project that we did down in Central Florida. So in our breakout session, we're going to get into talking a little bit more about our process, about what the charrette process is all about the ways that we go to market with organizations like S&B Construction and Collage down in Florida and Hammond Construction in Maryland and Erickson Hall. These are groups that have paired with us that get the big picture. We want that. We keep ourselves contractually distinct from one another because a little check and balance to the architect and the contractor is a healthy thing for you, and we'll emphasize how that works when we get to that stage in our breakout session.